Once a month, Paula Pant, host of the Afford Anything podcast, answers voicemail questions the listeners send in. Here's one now.
Hi, Paula. I have been a longtime listener and I love your show. My question essentially is, should we continue to rent out our home or should we sell it? My husband and I, we own a home in Northern California, but almost a year ago we moved to New York City and now we became renters. We decided to rent the house, and after mortgage, property taxes, property management fees are all paid for, we get about $150 in profit. We think that even with the small repairs and things like that at the end of the year we'll still be in the positive. My husband thinks that it's time to sell the house. He would like to sell it, invest the proceeds, probably putting it in index funds. I, on the other hand, think that we should keep the house, have somebody else pay for our mortgage, and once we reach FI, we could just either pay the house down or we'll be so much closer to having a mortgage paid for. Right now, we owe about $246,000 on the house at 3.5% interest. Because we purchased at the bottom of the market, we think a conservative selling figure would be about $425,000. What should we do? What would you do in this situation? Do you think that we should sell and invest the proceeds? We could always rent or purchase another home later on. Or would you have somebody continue to pay the mortgage even though it doesn't make that much profit? Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Ooh, this is an interesting one. First of all, congratulations on owning a house that has gone up in value so much. Okay, so here's how I would look at it. So based on the numbers that you gave, it sounds like if you sold the house, you could walk away with approximately $179,000 in your pocket. So $179,000 in an index fund at the 4% withdrawal rate, in other words, 4% of that amount, equals $7,160. In other words, if you were to sell the house, take all that money, put it in an index fund, and then use the 4% withdrawal rate as your guiding benchmark during FI, that money would produce an income stream for you of about $7,000 per year. So now the question is, take a look at this property. Forget about what it's making right now. What would it be making if the mortgage was completely paid off, if you held it free and clear? By looking at what that house will pay you if you held it free and clear, you can make an apples to apples comparison because, you're looking at the income stream that you would earn from an unleveraged asset, right? So you want to look at the income stream that an unleveraged house would give you so that you can compare the two options. That way you're comparing the assets themselves rather than looking at one through the lens of financing and the other not through it, because that's going to distort your comparison. Another way to look at it, and again, this is basically saying the same thing but from a different angle, is what is the cap rate on that property? And in order to calculate that, here's the official formula. First, you take the potential gross rent, which is the total amount of rent that the property could collect over the course of 1 year at full occupancy. So that's what's known as your potential gross rent. If it rents for $1,000 a month, for example, the potential gross rent is $12,000 a year. Then you subtract out some reasonable vacancy estimate, maybe 5%, depending on the neighborhood. From that, you add in any additional fees that you might collect. So for example, if you charge pet fees, if you charge parking fees, if you charge additional fees for storage, you add that in, and then the total is what's known as your effective gross rent. So then that is the number that you're working with. Now, from the effective gross rent, you then subtract out all of your operating overhead, property management, repairs, maintenance, property taxes, insurance, long-term capital expenditures. You subtract all of that out. The two items that you do not include are the principal and interest portions of the mortgage payment. Because again, that's financing and you want to evaluate financing separate from the deal itself. At the end of all of that, once you subtract the operating overhead from the effective gross rent, you are left with a number that's called the net operating income. And that net operating income divided by the price of the property is your cap rate. Now, there are two schools of thought, right? There are people who argue that you should, in terms of when you're comparing the net operating income to the price of the property, there are people who argue that you should compare it to the purchase price, by which I mean the price plus initial repairs required to get it rent ready for the first tenant. That's camp 1. And then camp 2, you have the other people who argue that you should compare it to the current value of the property. So in your case, camp 1 would say that you would compare the net operating income to the 246,000-ish, or no, sorry, that's what you currently owe on the mortgage. All right. So I don't know what you paid for the property. Let's say it was 300,000. I don't know. I'm pulling that number out of thin air. Camp 1 would say that you compare the net operating income to the $300,000 that you paid for the property. And Camp 2 would say that you would compare the net operating income to the $425,000 that the property is currently worth. I tend to be a little bit more in Camp 1 because, what you want to evaluate is the cap rate that you're getting on the deal that you have. You spent X amount on this property. Let's say it was $300,000. That's what you spent. So in my viewpoint, you want to see what kind of return you are currently getting relative to what you actually spent. But in your case, since you are evaluating opportunity cost, sure, you know what? Run the math twice, get both numbers, and also look at the total payout that you're getting. If you held it free and clear, the unleveraged payout, in terms of actual unleveraged free and clear cash flow. And then based on those numbers, I think you'll have your answer. There's one other thing that you said that I want to touch on. Within your question, you said, when we reach FI, what is your plan for reaching FI generally? Is your plan to reach FI primarily through index fund investing? Is your plan to reach FI through owning rental properties? Is it through owning businesses? What else are you doing and how else will you get there? Because essentially the question is, should we direct our assets into an index fund versus into a property? That is one pixel of a bigger picture. It's, one piece of the mosaic. That's the other thing that I would want to know is, how does this decision play into your broader plan to reach FI? And that context can take it in either direction. If you plan on reaching FI primarily through index funds, then there might be something to be said for holding on to a rental property in order to diversify a little bit. Or there might be something to be said for selling the rental property and just going 100% in index funds. It's important to understand how this fits into the bigger picture, but at the same time, the way that it fits could sway the decision either way. I guess what I'm trying to say is that there's no formula, but it's still important to contextualize.
Hey, did you enjoy this excerpt from the Afford Anything podcast? Then be sure to subscribe to Paula's YouTube channel. Not only is every podcast episode and Ask Paula question released here on YouTube, other creative deep thought videos are created just for you. Remember, you can watch anything, just not everything. Fill your YouTube viewing time with more videos to make you think and grow so you can afford anything. Go ahead, hit that little red subscribe button. We'll take care of the rest.